Good evening, everybody. I'm Dr. Vincent Baker. I'm the director of the Wheaton College Center for Applied Christian Ethics. I'm very glad we're doing this event. I'm going to explain the breadth and diversity of the community, have this panel discussion. And honestly, I want to give all the credit in the world to my office coordinator, Jill Caballero, because she really I'm very thankful for just the great partner that she is for all that we're doing for Applied Christian Ethics. So I hope that's not an embarrassment to you, but you should get your props. So now it's on the camera. So one of the reasons I think that this is really important, the Center for Applied Christian Ethics, we are about facilitating moral discernment. And I think one of the ways that we can facilitate moral discernment is by becoming people of curiosity, people who ask questions rather than by people who are already sure about what we know about things. Tonight's one of the greatest opportunities for us to really learn and grow, to develop the virtue of listening, and to join in this conversation after we hear from the panel for a while. It's a great listening and learning opportunity for us all. So I'm really thankful for everybody that's agreed to participate. And it's going to be led by my colleague, Dr. Danny Carroll. So I'm going to hand it off to him, and he will lead us.
Okay. Buenas noches. Good evening, everybody. I'm Dr. Danny Carroll Rodas. I teach Old Testament here. And you can see here on the screen, I can see on the screen back there. And we're going to be exploring the diversity of our Latino community here at Wheaton College. So one way you can appreciate that is by just the variety within our group. So let me begin at the end and we'll work our way down, but give us your name and a bit of your background.
Sure. David Claudio Iglesias from Panama. Came to the U.S. as a almost 7-year-old, grew up in New Mexico, not Mexico. Mexico, came to Wheaton and graduated in 1980, and law school, Navy for 30 years, and came back here in 2014 as a professor and head of the Wheaton Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics.
I'm Josh. I'm currently a senior at Wheaton College studying psychology with an IR minor. I grew up in Chicago. I'm Puerto Rican.
Good evening, my name is Silvio Vasquez. I serve Wheaton as the Chief Enrollment Management Officer, which means I have several offices that I collaborate with, undergrad admissions, financial aid, grad admissions, and some others. I am from Argentina. Came to this country when I was 4, settled in New Jersey. I went to a sister college back when there were 1,200 students, and I was one of the 2 Latinos on campus.
My name is Sofia Flores. I am Ecuadorian and Mexican. I am a senior at Wheaton College studying business economics and interpersonal communication. I am also the president of Unidad Cristiana, which is our Latina Hispanic club on Wheaton's campus.
Javier Beteta, I teach at the conservatory. I am a composer. I'm originally from Guatemala. Lived there until I was 19, and then I got a scholarship to study piano here in the U.S. Western Kentucky University, and then did my master's, my doctorate, and now I teach here.
And then my name is Alani Oyola. I'm Josh's sister, so also born and raised in Chicago. I'm Puerto Rican and Afro-Colombian, and I'm a senior English writing and urban studies.
So as I mentioned, I'm Danny Carroll Rodas. I'm Guatemalan American. My mother was Guatemalan. I spent a lot of my life in Guatemala, not only growing up but as a teacher. So as we've talked, we had dinner before. One of the things that we were thinking might be interesting to think about, and for you all to hear, is what our expectations are from us for tonight's panel. So maybe we'll work our way back down the other way. So I got the look of death there. What would you hope this panel would accomplish?
I guess something that I'm also on the Unidad cabinet. One thing that we talk about a lot is the way that the Latin community is homogenized on this campus. We all get the kind of immediate assumption once we start freshman year that we're Mexican, that we don't speak English. that we need help with a translator, or we have some type of other culture that gets set aside when we come to Wheaton. And so I think something that I would like to see from this panel is a way in which each person is kind of reconciling the two, reconciling their culture, their faith, their position or presence here at Wheaton, and not only kind of dismissing stereotypes, but also directly inverting them, even going so far as to disturb them and to really push back against some of the presuppositions that are put on the Latino community here. Yeah.
Yeah, I think having such a diverse panel from different backgrounds, different countries, I hope to learn, basically, to learn from everybody, and get a better perspective of the vibrant Latin community on campus.
I think similarly as well, I think as president this year, I've been faced with a lot of like, who belongs in your club questions. And I think, that made me realize that there's just so many like different things, people who are Hispanic and maybe don't speak Spanish, all those different things that I really wasn't faced with until collaborating with people and being in a position where like I kind of was looked at for the answer to that question. So I think in this panel, just even by knowing where we're all from, what we all look like, our experiences just shows the diversity even within the Latino community. So I think really just having that just as itself stand alone as like we all look different, we all have different experiences, but there's a place for us here.
For me, it's a time to share not only our stories, but to hear other stories as well, because they're unique stories. And to get rid of assumptions and presuppositions of what a Latino, Hispanic student, staff member, faculty is, how we should behave.
I think for me, similarly, a lot of it is I want the Latinos, Latinas present and who may see this after or anything to feel confident and secure in their own identity of being Latina, Hispanic, as well as this really be a time where people who have questions about what that means, whether in the community or outside of the community, feel comfortable to ask. And that, kind of like what everyone said, this can be a good just sounding board of the different experiences that we each had, touching on things that people have already shared and maybe other factors that people want to ask about.
I think for me, I'm going to dust off an old Russian proverb, which goes something like this. If you scratch a Russian, you find a Cossack. If you scratch a Latino, you find an indigenous American, an African American, or a European American, or a combination of the three. We are indeed what Vasconcelos wrote about as La Raza Cósmica, because we represent the entire world.
Yeah.
And I come from a little country called Panama that has Chinese and Japanese and Afro-Caribbeans and Europeans and indigenous Panamanian, everything, all in a little tiny country. So yeah, but I just want people to understand it's not one monolith, it's many pieces of the puzzle.
As you'll see that we're gonna have several questions up here, but Silvia Velasquez came up to me right before the panel started and had a great question for me to ask, because I'm moderating. So but it's an important question, and it may be a way to transition into the other ones. You may be aware that the Supreme Court took away race and ethnicity as some kind of factor in admittance to colleges around the country. And so it'd be interesting to hear your take as the Chief Enrollment Officer, how that has impacted how we recruit Latinos and Latinas.
Great question. We we have been preparing for this decision for like 2 years. The Students for Fair Admission at Harvard and at UNC Chapel Hill, reaching the Supreme Court and SCOTUS determining that affirmative action will be reversed. So immediately, as the person who oversees admission policy, we need to be prepared for that decision that we were expecting. So the questions started coming up. How are you going to recruit students of color and underserved students from African American, Hispanic, and other communities? We have to change the way we read applications. But I want to be clear. We've never made decisions favoring one people group over another. We always made decisions holistically. Students who are academically prepared, students who represent socioeconomic diversity, geographic diversity, international students. Our main emphasis was whoever the Lord calls here, if they were prepared, professing Christians, and academically ready to take on the rigors, we didn't isolate students based on one factor. So this is what we call a holistic review. Sadly, what happens when you have big players like Harvard and UNC Chapel Hill that are talking about hundreds of thousands of applications and selectivity of 5%, they sadly dictate how everybody else should make decisions. So for us, what that means to follow the law, when we're reading an application, we can no longer see any racial or ethnic identifiers. That's one of the Department of Education's guidance from the Supreme Court decision. I'm reading an application, I'm looking at the essay, I'm looking at the biographical information. We can no longer see race and ethnicity. Not that it mattered before, because what we're doing to recruit students from various communities, urban, rural, suburban, we're already identifying students who are called to apply. And then once they apply and they're admitted, then we know who we can pursue to talk about different programs and different scholarships. For example, Bridge or Church or Nieves Scholarship or the Burr Scholarship. Now, moving forward this year, we will continue to award multicultural scholarships, but we expect the Department of Ed to provide further guidance on being careful to do that, maybe even stopping that policy. So it raises questions about, well, affordability and access. Well, this is where our academic scholarships, our need-based grants, which we have been elevating, rising the amounts that we're awarding to students who qualify, are going to make up that gap. Will we be able to give out full tuition scholarships? We don't know. For example, Bridge is full tuition, Church is full tuition, Nieves is full tuition, Burr is not. But this is where this year we're not changing any academic scholarshiping policy or multicultural scholarshiping policy. We're going to see what happens through the course of the year. So the fall 24 freshman class will still have access to those. But then we're going to have to make a decision based on the SCOTUS ruling. Now, as far as our recruitment activity, we're doing a lot in admissions to build relationships and connections with schools that are minority. I'll give you an example. You may have heard me say that Bridge received a $350,000 grant from the Harold Smith Foundation to expand the program. Right now, Bridge is for students who are first generation, low socioeconomic profile, from urban communities, African American, Latino, underserved students in higher ed. So one of the things that we're going to do there is remove the racial component of Bridge. But I have been a part of launching initiatives like Bridge at other colleges that weren't based on racial identifiers. We're still going to go to communities that are minority majority and promote and build connection. So for example, Bridge is no longer just Chicago or West Chicago, which is where the populations have come from. We are now going to Milwaukee, to Augustine Prep, which is 100% underserved students. We're going to City School in Philadelphia, which is 100% African American population. We're going to Milwaukee, I'm sorry, I said Milwaukee. We're going to Indianapolis to Hope Academy. I had breakfast with the head of school there, and that school is 2 blocks away from where George Floyd was murdered. The head of school has a heart for the city of Minneapolis, and he wants to see his students come to Bridge. So it's not about, oh my goodness, what's happening with SCOTUS, or we're going to drop in diversity, are we no longer committed? We're doubling down. We're building relationships, connections. In June, through initiatives that we've been launching with schools, we're going to host a conference for 300 to 350 high school educators who are heads of DEI offices in their high schools, to understand what it means to be a community of care focused on racial justice. That will be the topic of the conference. And so we're inviting nationally school leaders at Christian high schools who head up DEI offices to participate in this initiative. So we're doing a lot. SCOTUS decision is what it is, but that doesn't hinder us. Only on reading a 5. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks. That's actually a very important part of this whole discussion moving forward. So you may have noticed that we had a new member join our panel. Now what we've done is we've given our names and a bit of our background. So I'll ask you, Debbie, to introduce yourself, and then we'll get to our first question on the slide.
Background in what?
Your name?
Yeah. Debbie Landez. Hello.
And then your kind of Latina background.
Yeah. So my dad is Mexican in Mexico City. My mom is from Guatemala. Antigua. So yeah, another Guatemala.
Yeah, we loaded the panel with Guatemala. So let's get to our first question, and I hope this works. Yes. So you kind of touched on this, Dr. Iglesias. What accounts for the racial diversity? You can see even on our panel we're very different. So you want to start, and anyone else who'd like to jump in, please feel free.
Yeah, I mean, just look at history. The Europeans came and they intermarried with the tribal groups for hundreds of years. I think Mexico was conquered in 1520, so that's 503 years ago, a long time ago. And also, I think that the Spanish didn't have hang-ups about interracial marriage like European groups did. So I think that facilitated that. But also, millions of Africans were brought to work in the Caribbean, work the sugar cane fields. A lot of them came to Panama, not as slaves, but to work on the Panama Canal, because we needed a massive manpower. The U.S. did. So we had a lot of Irish Panamanians, Afro-Panamanians, Asian Panamanians. All goes back to the building of the Panama Canal. It's that country, for a country that size, it is a melting pot, and it has been for the past 100 years.
Somebody else would like to say something?
I mean, I can share a little bit about my own personal experience. My dad is Afro-Colombian, so his family, from what we know, the legend goes, that due to the transcontinental slave trade, he and his patriarchal side of the family immigrated, or was really shipped to Colombia. They were transported from Africa, so they're very dark skinned, but they speak fluent Spanish, and came to Chicago with that perception of being a dark skinned Black person in the United States, but not being able to comprehend racial stereotypes or slurs because they spoke Spanish. And so they had a very unique experience in the US immigrating, and I think that is tied to a lot of the historical narratives that Captain Iglesias is kind of talking about. that colonization, imperialism, these things are all very intertwined in Latin history. And I think that's something that not a lot of us have language for because, yeah, I mean, they're just family legends. It doesn't mean that we have any archival documents to kind of support that. But I do think that it's important to kind of name and claim those things. For my family, that's something that we've traditionally honored and passed along in our own sense of oral history. And so I think that while there are a lot of white Latinos, I think something that's becoming more of a growing trend, I guess, is the Afro-Latin population in the United States, and really the self-identification of being Afro-Latino. So, yeah.
So, did your parents, where they couldn't identify with African-American US, and then people didn't think they would be Latinos or Latinos because the stereotype is you're not black.
Right.
So they were kind of in between.
Yeah, that's a hard one. There was both a very vigorous anti-blackness from the Hispanic Latin community that they faced, which is very difficult to experience racism in the language you do understand from the people that you assumed would support you, especially as they came into Chicago and they moved into a largely Hispanic neighborhood. They also, yeah, like you said, there was a certain type of shelter. I think that there was a little bubble they were in because as non-English speakers, they also were able to adapt better in a certain way because they were able to immigrate legally to the United States, which is a huge barrier for most Hispanic and Latin immigrants at the time. But a large part of that was because they were wealthier and they had more of the socioeconomic status to achieve that route of immigration. So that was already something that I kind of differentiated them from local African American or even Hispanic neighbors that they had. But then, yeah, I kind of put them in a unique position to experience racism on both sides of the coin.
Yeah, in Guatemala, where some of us have a background, about half of Guatemala is Maya. And so you have racism toward the Maya. And in Guatemala, when I was growing up, one of the worst insults you could give someone, we call them indio. When I was in Costa Rica, we lived there for a while. What I didn't know until I got there was Costa Rica's got a sizable black population, but they were not allowed to the main plateau where the capital is till 1948. They would have to get off the trains coming up from the coast, from Limon, which would be the area. They had to get off the train. They couldn't even come into the capital city until 1948. So you have a lot of those racial things going on. And huge populations, large Japanese population. In Brazil, there's millions of Japanese. When we were in Guatemala and our son was playing baseball, we went to the national stadium because they have the Pan American baseball games. And the Brazilian team ran out of the field and they were all Japanese. Japanese love baseball. And there they were, all Brazilian, but all Japanese Brazilian. So there's quite a mix. Does anyone else want to say anything before I go to the next question? Or are we good?
I would just say, in Argentina, they have an expression that Mexicans came from in Spanish. Cada uno de los aztecas, los poblanos vienen de los incas y los argentinos vienen de los barcos. So, for me, my ancestry is a mix of Italian and Spain, Italy and Spain, because in the late 1800s, immigration policies, people were leaving southern Europe and going to Argentina for opportunity. In the turn of the 19th century, it was the fourth wealthiest nation in the world. Now it owes billions to the International Monetary Fund. But then you have, in my family, indigenous Argentine from the Andean communities. So it's an example of our experiences mixing.
So I'm gonna challenge you, if you're interested in knowing what your racial background is, spend the $59 and.
He's talking me into
Find
it. I'm doing this.
Yeah, either 23andMe or Ancestry.com. So I do Ancestry. I found out I'm like 3% Norwegian.
Got that.
But, you know, but I am what I thought I was largely, which was indigenous, because my father was pure Kuna from Panama, Colombia, and my mother was German American. She didn't know that, but now I know. But if you're curious, do it, because it's fascinating. Because they send you information, they're constantly updating. I had a friend of mine who was Korean. He goes, I don't want to know. I'm Korean. I said, you don't know what your ancestors are doing 300 years ago. I bet you have Chinese, Japanese, and other things you can't even think about it. So I think I may have talked them into it too.
You sure it's not a scam? I mean, you in Norwegian, I can't.
I just said I'm afraid that my DNA will be out there and I'm wanted in 15 states.
I'll represent you.
Okay, so here's a thing that's quite a bit of discussion in this country is what do we call ourselves? And who gets the right to label us? Okay? And I would think maybe on this panel there'll be differences of opinion. So let me begin with Debbie. You get here late, I'm going to tell you. So you can see the question, what's the difference between the term Hispanic and Latino, Latina? Is the term Latinx used actually? Why are people, and why or why not?
I'll just go with it's a loaded question. I'll go with is the term Latinx used much? I think it really depends on the group of Latinos, Latinas. But I have also heard the term Latinx with an E, which I actually prefer, because Latinx is gender inclusive in English, but Latinx, if you think about it, we're Latinos, we're Spanish-speaking people. If I want to be gender inclusive in my heart language, I would use Latinx with the E. But it's still catching. I think it's very new. I know for my parents, their generation, they don't like the use of Latinx, because they're like, well, it's Latina, Latina. But I think it really just depends on your preference, and I think that's okay.
You're from Guatemala, so you're coming and watching this conversation from the outside, in a sense. I don't know you live here now, but so what is your thoughts about it?
Yeah, regarding Latinx, I have never really gotten used to it. I have not liked it either. And the first reason is because grammatically in Spanish it doesn't make sense. You know, you cannot say got Latinx and X at the end. You cannot have three consonants together. You need a vowel. So which tells me this probably didn't come from people who speak Spanish. Probably, you know, it didn't start in, you know, Ecuador or somewhere there, but it was probably more, I imagine, academia, somewhere in academia. And yeah, as I said, the first reason is it feels like a falta de ortografía, like an orthographic mistake, right? And I do care about the beauty of the language, the beauty of the tradition, right? If we are gonna change it, then Spanish is a language that uses la and el for everything. The chair, the table, the car, all of this has la or el, right? So if we are gonna do that change, we will have to change everything in the language. And I don't know who would want to do that change, right? At the same time, what do? We have this long tradition of literature, which there is a certain beauty in the language that I would prefer in this case to just keep the language as it is, because there are other ways to be political without destroying something that is beautiful.
Josh, you've been quiet, what do you think?
Yeah, kind of similarly. I mean, growing up here in Chicago, in the area, I kind of used them pretty interchangeably because especially English is my first language, so it took me having to ask and have that conversation with people to understand why don't people like Latinx. Like, I always saw it as like this is a gender neutral term that kind of is being used to encapsulate everyone into the conversation, especially in this American context, where we don't want people to be excluded for good reason. And so it took like talking and realizing why people maybe didn't prefer that term. I personally now use Latine a lot. It's just easier. Like it feels like it's a good alternative, in my opinion, to encapsulate everyone without having to constantly be like Latino, Latina, and using both. I still think that there is a place for Latinx. However, I do agree that it was not made by probably native Spanish speakers, but it was made in this American context. And so with that in mind, it's why I do think it still holds value. Although I have started to use Latine as kind of interchangeable to Latinx. So basically the same definition, just a different like way of saying it.
Do you see that?
Can we?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Billy.
No, I raised my hand. He nodded.
We'll have an open Q&A. But I'll let you know when.
So very quickly, in my mind, coming from New Mexico after Panama, Hispanic is what they use. They don't use Latino, because that's for people whose ancestors came from Latin America. They're probably Spanish, or so they say. But then I tell them, you don't know what your great grandfather was doing. You can't say that you're puro español. I mean, give me a break. And I had this exact conversation with one of my best friends, who looks like Don Quixote, a skinny guy. But his brothers and sisters looked into it, right? So I said, come on, Aldo, you are not pure anything. No one is in this country. But Hispanic is typically, where I'm from, your ancestors came from Spain. Whereas Latino, your ancestors came from Latin America. But if you're in New Mexico, you would never say, yo soy Latino. You would always say, yo soy Hispano.
I think there's an interesting parallel. Debbie, you mentioned generation. I think I'm older than your parents. We talked about that. That's kind of shocking to me. Debbie worked in admissions for several years. But there's an interesting parallel here between a generational experience of our parents came to this country and they're navigating a new language, a new culture, and the children come here when they're younger and they're navigating a different culture, where the school experience, you're learning the English language and you're coming to terms with what it means to be in America, while you go home and it's your Hispanic Latin culture, right? And so how do you put language to that experience? And so I value the tradition that Dr. Beteta speaks to and the generational comparison here as well. So there's a lot to navigate there, where we talk about inclusivity and just language is complex. So there are a lot of factors here.
I'm writing a book. We're turning in the manuscript next week called Reading the Bible Latinamente with Ruth Padilla, some of you know her, and Miguel Echevarria, who's a New Testament scholar at a seminary in this country. But this is one of the questions, but we're very committed to the Latina church. And the Pew Research Center did a study, and they found that less than 3% of the Latino population uses Latinx. And 75% never even heard of them. And so our decision was to stick with Latino, Latina, because that's what our people actually say. And so, in our churches. So if we're trying to actually connect with our churches, what kind of language do we use? So this is going to be an ongoing conversation. I think, Josh, you're right in terms of navigating this in a very different world, which is the US world. And we have second and third generation, and that makes it more complicated. And so you're seeing probably differences on this panel. So that's mirroring the national conversation. Yes,
I think it's also, going back to your original question, talking about like who gets to label us. I think it's a very interesting topic, because I think even in Unidad, when we're talking about the student groups, we say Hispanic, /Latinx, and now we're using Latinx. So I think it really goes into what you identify as. If you want to use Latinx, you feel like that encompasses your identity. If you want to use Latina, Latino, Hispanic, whatever you feel like. But I go also back to the generational thing. I remember having this conversation with my grandparents, and my grandparents were like, "Yes, Latinx, like Latino is girl and guy," so they see it as, Latino is encompassing to everyone, right? So I think that it's also interesting in the context of thinking about language, how it doesn't really translate in this culture to like their generations or their culture, because they feel like the word Latino is encompassing of those things.
Kind of jumping off that though, I do think Latinx serves a really interesting position though, because it does open the conversation for you to have harder, for you to really address systemic issues of patriarchy within Hispanic households, which is hard. You can't do that lightly, and sometimes you can't even do that in one language. So introducing an American concept or more of a United States-centered idea like Latinx is very difficult, but I think it is able to kind of serve as somewhat of a wake-up call, or something that's a bit jarring and doesn't make a lot of sense to older generations or to people that maybe haven't heard this word in a Christian context, to kind of talk about, well, why is it that our default is Latino? What does that say about the way that we express culture as Hispanic people? Why are we defaulting to masculine? And why does that matter now, centuries later? Does it still matter? So I think that that's like an interesting conversation that Latinx kind of serves as. Also, in terms of like the very beginning question, I don't think we really addressed, besides Captain Iglesias, the difference between Hispanic and Latino, Latina. Hispanic typically refers to Spanish-speaking persons. That isn't always inclusive of the Latin community, because there are a lot of no sabo kids. There are a lot of people that do not speak Spanish as a first or second language. And so the implementation of Latino, Latine is very inclusive for those that identify within the Latin community but don't speak Spanish, don't have the language connection to the culture. Also, Latino, Latina has typically included those from Brazil that don't speak Spanish as well. They speak Portuguese. And so there are some nuances within these labels that give some more breadth and diversity to the Hispanic community, the Latin community, because you're able to encompass more. But Latinx, in my opinion, does kind of start the conversation that is a little bit more difficult to have.
Okay.
My hometown It's a great question.
Here's the problem from where I sit. I'm looking at a lot smaller letters. But basically what it says is this, because I saw this question before I came. Why is the Latino Latina contribution to this country's history basically ignored? Because it predates New England. And oftentimes when you think about US history, it always begins Massachusetts Bay Colony and all this kind of stuff, or Jamestown, things like this, which I understand. But if you're looking at Florida or Southwest US, it's actually older history. I know you had some comments on it, because Captain Iglesias is kind of our resident historian here. So how do we handle it? I mean, you're from Santa Fe, right?
Yes.
Did you write this question? Okay.
Yeah, so, I mean, I remember coming, when I came here to Wheaton as an undergrad, a long time ago, late 1970s, they would ask me where I'm from. And then I'll say, do you know anything about Santa Fe? No. I mean, like nothing, just blank page, right? But if you ask them, what about Plymouth Rock and Jamestown, they know all about that, because that's what they were taught. But we are the United States of America. We're not just 13 original colonies, right? So, yeah. So I put this question up there to see if anyone else in this room has dealt with the same issue. I suspect you probably have many years after I did deal with it. And when people come to Santa Fe, it blows your mind. You mean there was a Spanish presence here that long ago? Yeah. Read your American history. You know, because this country was founded by a lot of different peoples, not just the builders. You know, they were beach. But even there were people there who weren't Christians. And then the French were up in this part of the country, the Russians were up in Alaska, parts of Washington State, and the Spanish were pretty much everywhere else, from Florida to California, up the coast. Just look at the names, like when you go home, go to a map and look at the names. Like my friend here is from Los Angeles. You know, those are Spanish words. And I'm from the full name of my hometown is, let's see if I can get it right. La Villa Real de San Francisco de Asís. So the City of Holy Faith of San Francisco of Assisi is the actual name of Santa Fe, but we boiled it down to two words: Holy Faith.
And it gets more complicated because we come from different countries, we come with different histories. Right?
That's right.
So Guatemalan history is very rich, very different. So what makes this whole history conversation more complicated in this country is that we bring new histories into the conversation. So it enriches it, but it's what most people don't know.
Yeah, and Florida cracks me up, because Florida was founded by the Spanish. You know, St. Augustine wasn't founded by, you know, in Miami. I mean, no offense against anybody from Miami. But the Spanish have been in Florida for a really long time. So it tickles me when I hear people, how some of those people home? Well, they've been here longer than anyone else. Except the Seminoles and Miccosukee, you know?
We'll go from the longest question of the night. Yeah, so we've kind of hit on this one. Can I begin? Yeah, I'm running this one. I was raised bilingual and bicultural in Houston. And we would go to Guatemala every year. And we'd spend our summers in Guatemala. And my parents would put us in school, because the Guatemalan school year begins in mid-January and ends in mid-October. So summertime here was like mid-year in Guatemala. And so I always was around Spanish speakers, and our friends in Houston, there's a large Cuban community in Houston, and my brother actually married a Cuban. And so then we went to Guatemala. He was a professor there for many years. And then I came back to the US, and for the first time in my life, I met Latinos who didn't speak Spanish. I never met anybody like that, ever in my life, until I was like 40. And then, or they'd speak in Spanglish, you know, like llevarme para atrás, which makes no sense.
That's so Puerto Rican.
Yeah, which is just a, you know, call me back, but you would never say it that way. It makes no sense in Spanish. Or like viaje redondo, it's a round trip. It's ida y vuelta, right? So all this stuff, la troca, cachar, all this stuff. And then of course, because of the way I look, Spanish is not supposed to come out of my mouth, which is something I've had to do. And I'm 6'6". Don't do that to me. So I'd speak Spanish, and I would speak better Spanish than they, and it was like this total disconnect, right? So, on campus, you're talking about Unidad Cristiana, okay? How does the Spanish thing work? And you're the president, so let me go get Sophia.
Well, I am not a No Sabo kid. But I think personally, I grew up speaking Spanish with my grandparents because that's the only language they spoke. They raised me, for the most part, with my parents working a lot. So that was my tie to my heritage, was Spanish. It's all I really knew when it came to my grandparents, even when I communicated with them, the only way they taught me my culture. And a lot of my friends were similar, so I never really had an experience where Spanish was rarely speaken at home or never really spoken. But how that translates to Unidad is, we have a lot of No Sabo kids on our cabinet.
Let me ask you this. Does everyone know what a No Sabo kid is?
No.
Why don't you explain that?
Oh yeah. A No Sabo kid is saying I don't understand, they don't know Spanish. They are Hispanic, but they don't speak Spanish, so they it's this word that they use to
You're
describe
saying no
themselves.
sabo.
No Sabo.
Which
Yeah.
is grammatically.
Grammatically
Correct,
correct.
right. So it's
Only No
it's-
Sabo kids would call it No Sabo.
Yeah. It's not the grammatically correct way of saying I don't know. So that's why it's kind of like a pun in the word. So we have a lot of people on our cabinet who don't speak Spanish, a lot of people who come to our events that don't speak Spanish, but they still have a tie to the community. But then there's also people who grew up only speaking Spanish, that being their first language, and them coming into Unidad looking for that experience, walking into a room and being why are these people speaking English? I thought this was the place to have our conversations in Spanish. So I think for me, as a president, and for being on Unidad all 4 years, and being somebody who's, my first language is English, but I do know Spanish, is kind of an interesting thing, because you want to make both people feel important, right? You don't want to be well, you're more Spanish because you speak Spanish, or you're less Latino because you don't. And I think even people wanting to play into their, or get closer touch to their culture and don't speak Spanish feel like Unidad isn't for them, or that they're not allowed in that space. So I think we've tried to do this bilingual thing, where we welcome Spanish. If you want to have that conversation, if you want to speak in Spanish to one another, if we're playing games and that's the way you think is in Spanish, you want to speak in Spanish, we are always open to that. But also if you don't know Spanish, that's okay too. So even our chapel services are bilingual. So we try to honor both, because I think both play an important role in our heritage.
And Debbie, you're a graduate of the undergrad, now you're on the grad side, but you were also working in missions and things. So as you look back over your time here, how do you, and you're with Unidad as well, right?
Unfortunately, I was not with
Oh, okay. But what about your experience?
Yeah, it is. I was processing right now. I was just thinking Spanish was technically my first language, but then when I got into the American education system, I had to lose it because there was no ESL. I went to a private school as well, So there's no ESL. I remember learning English in a little closet with a random teacher because that's all they had to offer. So I slowly started, kids are sponges. I learned English really quickly. But I lost the value of Spanish, and my parents tried to keep me proud of being Latina by motivating me to speak Spanish at home, but I refused because everyone at school only spoke English. So I was like, why do I need to do that? That's weird. That's my mentality when I was little. And even in high school, I was very much ashamed of being one of the few Latinas in my school. So coming into Wheaton, I was like, I'm not gonna be part of UNIVA. I'm assimilating 100%. And I tried, but then I felt so out of place while I was a freshman. I think my freshman year was one of the hardest years because I did not connect with my white peers. There were just things that we just didn't connect. I find this funny now, but my freshman year, my dad had to go to Mexico for something, and one girl on my floor, she said, "Oh, can your dad come back?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" She's like, "Can he come back legally?" And I was like, "Oh, excuse me? Why do you assume that my dad cannot come back legally?" So that's when I started facing just questions of my identity as a Latina in this space. It was rough. It was really hard. But I was also a Spanish major, so that's where I started reading a lot of American literature. So I remember reading Sor Juana Inés, just Cervantes and all that stuff. And I just was like, oh my gosh, I've been missing out on my language and the beauty of everything that has come from my people. So yeah, my experience is very different to that of Josh or Fia or Kalani, but it's one that is valid as well. So yeah,
Silvio.
Language for me plays a huge part. The position I hold at the college and then I've held at other campuses. My parents didn't go to high school when they came to this country. I was 4 years old. My dad operated machinery. He'd leave the house at 4:30, come home at 5, pick me up, and we'd go clean offices 5 days a week till 11 o'clock at night. When I travel for the college, language for me is so important because I look at the faces and the mothers, the people who are cleaning the hotel rooms. I think of my mom. Cleaning the bathrooms in the airports, I think of my dad. And I go up to them and I am in a suit. They can't tell I'm Latino, but I speak with them and I want to hear their stories. It's how we treat each other with dignity. Growing up in my house as Argentines, we had asados every weekend. In the summer and when it was still warm out. And my dad's friends from work would come over, from Ecuador, from Guatemala, from Puerto Rico, from Cuba. And I had the hardest time understanding their dialects. They would speak to me so fast, and I look at my dad, I'm 9, 10 years old. But it is just so important to understand the uniqueness of each culture, but also the common struggle.
Yeah, I wanted to say that language is kind of like a way of thinking and a way of logic that builds the way you process and the way you think. And for me, for example, because I am bilingual, it is almost as if it's a different person when I speak Spanish or when I speak English. It's like you have to switch.
Do you dream in English or Spanish?
Do I what?
Dream.
I think Spanish.
I scared my wife one time because I started shouting in Spanish. Sorry.
Yeah, so I think it is deeply embedded in the identity, of who you are. Language is the way you build thoughts and you process thinking. And, so yeah, that makes it.
I just want to add one layer of complexity. What if you grew up trilingual? Because I grew up on my dad's reservation in Panama. So I learned his language, Kuna, which I used in the village, and then Spanish at school and English at home, because my mother was Anglo. So I don't remember any of this, but my parents told me I would sometimes in one sentence use all three languages. But what happened when I moved to the States is I wanted to learn English completely, and I rejected the other languages. I had to relearn them when I went back to high school. And I think this is a critical question. Because for me, without language, what are you? For me, I'm not tethered to my cultures.
You know, if I can just add some things. As I've traveled the country for Hispanic education stuff, it's been a common experience of young people growing up ashamed of their language, or their parents going through humiliating things and refusing to teach their kids Spanish so the kids would not go through what they went through. So I hear that all over the country. And then there's a phenomenon around the country as well of students from Latino backgrounds now wanting it, and now becoming Spanish majors. And, sometimes it's third generation, and there's this movement back to roots. Another piece of this, it's your heart language. What's your heart language? So, like, I go to an Anglo church in the morning, and I go to Ese Pueblo in the afternoon. I need to be singing in Spanish. I need that. And I'll be crying in that church, which I won't be in the English, and lifting my hands. I mean, it's just a totally emotional difference for experience. And, you know, even Latin love songs. English is awful for this. But, you know, the Latin music and the love songs, you know. The wonderful thing is my wife is Anglo, right? But she gets it. You know, but I'll say this one for the last question. There's things, I've been married a long, long time, 47 years. I married when I was like 12. There's things that I feel she cannot feel. And she that's okay. We have these long conversations, because after all these years of marriage, I'm still trying to figure out who I am. And so it's good to have a spouse that kind of gives me that space to process. I need counselors. Okay. We only have about 27 more minutes, so I'm going to show you more questions we've got. But we'll go for about another 7 or 8 minutes, and then we'll open it up. Okay? But here's one, which actually I think is probably a good place, right? How can we foster these kind of conversations on campus about Latino diversity, not only among yourselves, but it was kind of fun. We were having dinner before, and these 3 students were watching the banter between the different profs, and I think kind of enjoying that, right? But how can we foster this? I'd like to hear maybe from the student side. Maybe we'll start with you, Josh. And then maybe if there's any faculty want to jump in, or staff, let's see. So Josh, you want to try and handle this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing that comes to mind is just when Dr. Peteta said of what he hoped for this panel, of just this being really going into these things, not just events like this, but just everyday life as an opportunity to learn. As someone who grew up in Chicago and felt very disconnected from my roots a lot of my life, the only way that I really got that back was from learning it through family, learning it through others. So fostering conversations really does require a posture of first humility and curiosity of what is it about you and your culture that I can learn and grow from that is different than mine, not in a better or worse, but just in a, oh wow, different. I mean, even in this panel, I'm Puerto Rican, and that's very different than Guatemalan and Ecuadorian, Mexican. And so fostering that, I don't know, I feel like I've seen it a lot just casually. It's just like, oh, even between like other Hispanic students and other Hispanic faculty of like, oh, like this is what this is in my language and like my native dialect, and this is what it is in mine. And so really just like fostering that like curiosity between each other and making space for that. I think it's just like, I have really appreciated being able to talk openly with staff and faculty and profs about these things that are near and dear to my heart, especially when that staff, faculty, prof is also reciprocating that. And it's not just like information, but it's like we're really connected here. But yeah, that's what I would say.
So what does the sister have to say?
I think something that we've desired in Unidad for the last 4 years that I've also been a part of the community, has been for faculty to really show up for us. I think we've gone through varying waves of faculty engagement with Unidad as a club. And so something that I was really encouraged by this year was seeing Dr. Carol and Dr. Beteta at our Bajo las Estrellas event, because they showed up and they danced together. It was very lovely.
Beside each
So I think that's been really something that's helpful for me in fostering these conversations, is having connections with people, and seeing the way that faculty and staff are willing to hang out with students when they're not being paid to, is really encouraging, because they stayed late and they were interested and wanted to engage not only the cabinet but also the Latino students, the student body that was there. So that's one way. One way that I think we can foster more conversations about diversity is showing up for each other. When Dr. Carroll has an event, I want to be there. I want to be at his book signing. So we can talk about some of the different ways that his experience is interconnected and also impacting mine. He's been at Wheaton for way longer than I have been. So it's longer, not way longer, not way longer. That's my bad. He's been at Wheaton longer than I have. Just by like a year or so. So I think it's interesting to have this type of community and camaraderie when you just start showing up for each other more. Yeah.
Let me ask Sophia, do you have something to say?
Yes, but she can go first.
Okay, Sophia, just because you're ahead of Unidad, that might be a good word.
Yeah, I think something too that I've been thinking about a lot is, I think I even see it in my own family, there's like, because there's so many different like countries that we're all from, there sometimes is this posture of like, well, we're the best country and like our way is the right way. I see my grandpa, oh my god, my grandpa's Ecuadorian, and he is very prideful in that. And he thinks he's the best. So I think too, like engaging in those conversations, people to be like, you know, having an open mind of like, okay, I may not say that word the same way that you do, or like have the same, like even my mom's Mexican, my dad's Ecuadorian, even the way they speak to one another, they have different words for things sometimes, right? So even them fostering conversation, I kind of translate here when I'm president of Unidad and like doing these things, and like being like, not everybody is gonna have the same experience just because we're all Latino, Hispanic, right? So I think it's being open to that posture of like, okay, maybe my way is my way, but it may not be everybody else's way. And you know, knowing that, and that there is a beautiful diversity. And yeah, I think even we had a family dinner for Huila a couple weeks ago, where it was just for Latino and Hispanic students. We just like got together, played some games together, and ate. And I think even through that meal, we were just able to engage in these conversations of like, where are you from? And like, you know, how's your time at Wheaton been? How do you still take pride and like continue celebrating your culture while you're here? So I think just engaging and being open, having that posture of openness is really important.
Yeah.
But we won the World Cup.
My dad may have been rooting for you, but that was
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Well, she jumped in, so we'll move to a little bit that.
This is the football distracted.
As Silvio mentioned, I did work for admissions, and I think one way we could foster from the very beginning is to put a question about diversity on the application. I think it's super important to have students coming in already with that mentality, so that it doesn't just fall on the different groups of students on this campus already, like the Latinx community, the Black community, or the Asian American community. So yeah, I think that would be really great.
We did put a question on diversity.
Okay, because last year we didn't have it.
Yeah, I think it was providential to do that in light of what we thought was coming with SCOTUS. Because the SCOTUS decision also says when students volunteer that in their storytelling, you can use it. It's great we have that essay question.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think campus has a very rich, it has a lot of events that have some aspect of diversity. Just last week there was a amazing panel of indigenous scholars from Panama and Quechua, Ecuador, which is something we don't see that often, and so students probably didn't know about it, or we are all too busy that we just forget. I have forgotten so many things, but like that, I have seen tertulias, where people speak Spanish and meet together to talk about a certain topic, football, one of those. So I think just kind of like be attentive, because there is a lot of events that are quite interesting and quite amazing, and that's a way to engage in this conversation. Another way is, we as faculty, we have a reading group. What do? We read Latin American novels, and it's something to connect with the culture, to discuss that. So and our students also outside campus have, these other things that can connect with other people.
Yeah, so the reading group is Dr. Beteta, Dr. Jamie Huff, who did community work in El Salvador. And myself. What's that?
He's from Concord.
Yeah, in anthropology. Yeah, I would say two things, and then we'll start opening it up. And so, Billy, I'll let you have the first question. Again, I haven't been here that long. But one thing I watch even the chapel, and this is going to sound like the old guy. I want so bad for the Latino students to love who they are, just to embrace su Latinidad. And so to watch you all up there just warms my heart. You're all kind of nervous. It's okay. I mean, it's just awesome. And so I just want you to embrace the food, the music, the calor humano. One thing that we need to work on, I'm in the grad school, so I am like totally disconnected. And so there has to be a way maybe of connecting some of us in the grad school, because I'm not with undergrads at all, except for one class. And so maybe that could be something to think about. Okay, we've got about 15 minutes, right? And so Billy, I know you've been waiting patiently.
I'm good, I got the answer. I wonder is when we were talking about Hispanic, versus using some variation, Latino, Latina, Latinx, Latinx, and my question, because I just read everything I can get my hand on about Gen Z, had to do with the focus on gender neutrality that's very important to Gen Z. And that causes across communities, you know, this friction between the grandparents in my age range and, you know, the high school students, college students of Gen Z. And one of the things that is striking to me is there's the age and generational differentiation, but there's also what I see as the Christian higher ed versus all other higher ed. And you know, embracing the terminology Latinx, it was good for me to hear, like, from you guys, that first of all, that's grammatically incorrect, Dr. Batena. But I'm just like, wow, this is going on in households of all ethnicities, y'all. It's like, you know, people are saying whether it's within Anglo households or Black households, what you know, what do we call our friends who are Hispanic? You know, because my daughter wants me to say Latinx, and I'm like, it's Latino, Latina, you know. But I was just so blessed. Alani, that was really, really helpful, because she basically answered the question. Is the generational thing, and when I heard Dr. Carroll saying only what percent? 3%? Less than 3%. That makes sense to me. You know, we're in higher ed, we're in Christian higher ed, and so I know that the first time it was written, the department that I used to work in, career development, it was like, don't use that. You know, we're a weak college, we don't use the X. And I was like, you better get used to it, because these kids gonna be using it. But yeah, so that was helpful.
And if I can add something to that, I think you're very helpful for me. The thing that bothers me sometimes, and I've had this with some non-Latino, Latina colleagues, who become the allies. And so sometimes what happens is, it's tag team. Is that people start telling us how we can talk about ourselves. And then I'm being corrected about how I can talk about myself. Yeah. Did you want to, and then Alex, you had a question, right? So we'll go here and then Alex. It's okay.
Yeah, as a follow-up to that, I believe the term Hispanic was first used by the Census Bureau as a descriptor of people who can trace their heritage back to Spain, whether they were from Latin America or who you know, were from Spanish descent here in the States. So it's kind of a demographic term, and then the term Latino, Latina really came from the media. So both elements are trying to do exactly what you say. They're trying to define how we describe ourselves. And I think it's perhaps a term, these terms come from the idea of marketing. How do we, you know, brand these populations so we can market to them? Yeah. And I think there is a struggle in the sense of that interaction. How are they defining us, and how do we define ourselves? And you know, is a struggle in a place where you know, there's so much variability that we talked about here today. So it's an ongoing process, and I don't think it's simple. I think it may work for a certain period of time, and then it's going to become passé, and ridiculous and then move on to something else. So,
And about half is from the same Pew study, about half of the Latino population actually refer to themselves by the country of origin.
yeah, exactly.
So they'll say, oh, I'm Guatemala, or I'm Puerto Rico, or, you want to add something? And then Alex has been very patient. So.
Yeah, just to what you said, I think I agree. It's sort of, you said marketing and then it will become passé. When I first came to the US 20 years ago, the word was, what was the word that was used most of the time for diversity? I totally forgot now, sorry. How do you say, well, tolerance. Tolerance. That was the word for diversity, and everybody was talking about tolerance and tolerance. Today, nobody talks about tolerance. It switched to something else. 10 years ago was political correctness. Nobody talks about political correctness anymore. It has mutated into something else. So I think, yeah, I would prefer to keep, the language and read Cervantes and read Borges as what it is, and not later on they would read Borges and it's like, doesn't make sense, So that's how I wanted to know.
Alex Askins, I teach Politics and International Relations here at Wheaton College. I want to preface this by saying I asked this question as a friend. I know many of you personally, almost all of you personally, and also as a co-laborer in the kingdom. So I'm wondering, it's been, what, a month and a half now, since the Historical Review Task Force was dropped. How are you all processing that? And specifically, as a political scientist, I'm thinking, how are you all approaching the institutional commitments that the trustees have committed to in thinking about racial inclusion, diversity? I realize some of you were on the panel or on the task force. There might be a wide variety of views on the panel, but I'm really curious, the sort of structural and institutional commitments, how are you processing that?
One thing, I'll start off, with all due respect. And we hear this on campus and around the country. The Latino population is the largest minority in the country. It's now 64 million and growing. But conversations, and there's historic reasons which I can appreciate, it gets reduced to the black-white binaries.
Yes.
That totally dominates the conversation. But there's good historical reasons for that. I mean, the African-American experience is unrepeatable and it's unique. So it's apples and oranges. It's just a different thing. And that would be just kind of initial. It just seems there's more complexity to be fleshed out, perhaps.
And part of what I'm asking here is, so I think conversations, dialogue is great, but in terms of holding the institution accountable for progress, particularly for Latinos, how are you processing?
One thing, and then I'm talking too much. But
No, you're not.
I was talking to a student from UNIDA before your time. Years before your time. I've only been here 7 years.
Was Blanchard in that conversation?
46 years ago.
I'm just getting abused. But I think here's the challenge. How do we do this in a constructive way? And I told this student, you want things to change tomorrow, and you're here for 4 years, and when you're gone, I'm still here. We've got to think 10 years from now. What is this going to look like? Because it's not going to happen tomorrow or next year. It's got to be the slow grind. And, Billy's been here a long time, and it's been a slow grind. And, 3 steps back, maybe forward, maybe a step back, it's one of these things. So how do we help constructively? It's easy to critique. I mean, that's the easiest thing in the world. Give me a solution. Help me move forward. And then one of the things that I've learned, and maybe each of you in your own way, is that sometimes those from another ethnicity, they just don't get it. They just don't see it, and it's almost like, I don't know if you ever will. I just don't know. So how to move it constructively would be the challenge, even in my own department. Student recruiting, which is really hard in grad school for Latinos, and mainline schools are giving them full rides and stipends. Christian schools can't compete with that. And it's not only at doctoral levels, it's master's levels. They're getting full rides with stipends if they're Latinos or Latinos. And so it just makes it, so it's kind of the chicken and the egg thing. How do you get more Latinos on campus? If they come, they don't see very many. I mean, it's just kind of, how do we do this? But this is a national phenomenon. It's not just unique to Wheaton at all. All evangelical Christian schools are wrestling with minority recruiting because we don't have the money. So it's all So anyway, that's my kind of gut reaction on something. It's a long conversation. Do you want to say something?
I have a question.
Okay, so we've only got about 5 minutes.
Yeah, but I think it's an important one that hasn't been brought yet, which is, how do you navigate what people assume is your political commitments? People assume because they see you what they think your political commitments must be. One way or another. Oh, are you this way or that way? And it may not be, hey, who you voted for, whatever, but there's something that is said to you where there's something presumptive about what you're thinking, and how political you must be, or how you're really happy because this decision was made, there was this policy, or whatever.
Welcome to the church today.
What do you want to? I'll give you my point of view. John, I was watching your body language.
I'm trying to figure it out. I think it's just so nuanced because, even outside of that, right, there's always presumptions made about the Hispanic, Latino community. So when I look at this panel, I think we're all Mexican. And so I feel like personally when I've had to undergo that, it's been really hard because there's been a lot of people like, oh, like, you're happy with this happening? It's like, not really, actually. But conducting myself in a manner that is still honoring to myself, to them, to an extent, but is also true to myself and pushes back on, like, why are you assuming this about me and my community just because we are this way? That you think, oh, this is gonna make me happy. But that's just me. I think there's a lot to it.
I think I've worked with immigration now for about 16 years. And I would say, in terms of political parties that curse on both their houses, they've used us as a football for as long as I've been working on it, trying to get votes. And then as I work with Latinos on this subject, not all of them are going to be pro-immigrant. Cubans will process this very differently. Puerto Ricans will process it differently. Because before Obama, if a Cuban touched U.S. soil, they were legal. Just touched. That's why I didn't want the boats to land, because if they touched U.S. soil, they were legal. And so, the Cuban, out of Miami, I have a